Welcome to EPG Pathshala. My name is Alok Pandey and I teach anthropology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Hyderabad. In the module that I'll be dealing with is titled Women and Education in the 19th Century India. And this module is written by Dr. Archana Verma and I am delivering the lecture. And this is part of a course called Women and History, which is part of Women's Studies. What will we learn in this module? This module is about women's education in the 19th century. We will learn about the reform movements related to women's education and the various points related to it. We will learn about the development in reform movements related to women's education. We will critically approach the understanding of women's education and its writing in history. In the last quarter of 19th century, it saw the growth and influence of modern education under the influence of British rule in India. As a result, a section of society was educated in the West in Western education institutions. And these Western educated members or people from India were exposed to Western education and its values. And the education system, primarily of the Western kind at that time, focused on the ideas of equality, justice, freedom, and rational thought. These are all elements of a modern society or modern systems which members who were exposed to learnt about it and brought these ideas back in the context of India. Now, this had a different outcome. The efforts of these people who were part of these reform movements brought these ideas and related it to the status of women in the 19th century, besides other problems of Indian society. Well, since the course is focusing on women, we will be talking about the status of women in education in the context of India in the 19th century and how these values of equality, justice, freedom, and rational thought was brought into the context of reforming women and education. Because of these individuals who were exposed to the Western system of education, they contextualized it in the context of women education in India, and women education emerged as essential for the growth of modern Indian society. Because the status of women, as we know, was very, very poor in the context of 19th century India. So, educating women became the central focus of the reform movements. Besides education, the other concerns of the reform movements was women's participation in public spaces, participation in the freedom struggle, the rights to inheritance by women, and marriage became issues that required immediate attention. And in relation to this, what we see is various viewpoints emerged regarding reform movements related to women's education. Now, the author of this module identifies two major historiographical models useful in understanding 19th century reform movements. And these two models are, one is a proactive reform model and the second is a retroactive reform model. Now, what do we mean by these two terms, proactive reform model and a retroactive reform model? In the proactive reform model, the historiography emphasizes a positive or a constructive development in society. That means these reform movements contribute to a positive change, or a kind of change which is required or essential for the growth of society. The retroactive reform model, on the other hand, is somewhat negative, as it seeks to maintain the society in a backward level, which means, well, the status of women should change, but they should continue in some form or the other. Whereas the proactive reform model would emphasize more on the individual, the role of women as individuals and their contribution or change in the context of society. So these two models are maybe two sides of the same scale. We can understand it that way if we wish. Now, what are the arguments which make up the proactive reform model? The proactive reform model argued that the 19th century reform movements for women uplifted their condition. So the proactive reform model was arguing that these reform movements changed or uplifted the condition of women. And it emphasized on that women were modernized by the contribution of the Western system of education, either at home or in schools. In other words, the Western system of education contributed to the outlook and change of women or the status of women in the context of Indian society. But how was all this to be achieved? This could be achieved by learning the English language. So English language and learning of the English language played an important role or contributed as an important factor in modernizing women in the context of 19th century India. The retroactive reform model, on the other hand, evolved in the last quarter of 20th century. It was retrogressive in some sense, as it was not aimed at helping women emerge as independent individuals. It was still emphasizing certain traditional elements to be continued. So in that sense, it is not really a feminist movement to liberate women from their traditional structures. So women were still caught in the context of the traditional structures, but it was still talking about reform. Now, the main arguments of the retroactive reform model was reform was a strategy. It was a strategy to maintain the family in the modern world, because the role of the women in the context of family is very, very central. So, reform should contribute to change, but it should maintain the context of family in the modern context of society. And women's education in this context was seen to help them or aid them to become better homemakers. So the emphasis was not that they become independent individuals who could take decisions by themselves or could craft their own future, but this system of education would then return and contribute back at the homes where the woman was located. In other words, the education system, the modern education system, through the retroactive reform model, argued that education would contribute to women and women would then transfer this to children. In other words, it would be that women are better child rearers and they would carry out the household responsibilities in a better manner because of the education that they have achieved. Now we see that this idea of women getting an education but still coming back and contributing at the household and household responsibilities or childbearing is still very much prevalent and exists in many parts of India. And what we see is the writings in the retroactive reform model is basically a reaction against the Eurocentric critique of colonial India. Reformers tried to respond to this change by stressing upon the education of women. But what we saw was the continuation of a masculine dominance. Finally, in spite of all education exposure, men were the last decision makers about any issues or matters. and it was not the women who could take these decisions. This is how the writings have been portrayed in understanding the retroactive model. Now, what we see is the retroactive reform model was primarily, or the social reforms which was in this context, dealing with the retroactive reform model, was these concepts were from Western feminist theory. That means they're still denying on ideas which are coming from the West. And these issues were primarily revolving around women's aspirations and ambitions and their role in the decision-making process that was pertaining to the women's control over their own body, mind and thought. Though it did take into aspects related to the professional arena. However, if we look at both the proactive model and the retroactive reform model, what emerges from this is that Indian society has been painted as a very homogeneous presentation of society. But whereas what we see is that Indian society is very, very diverse. This diversity is not accounted in these two models. In other words, there is not much understanding of the divergent situations across the Indian subcontinent. In other words, these reform movements and how these models which have been constructed around these reform movements in relation to education particularly did not take into account for the large-scale diversity which exists in the context of society. It may happen that sometimes similar problems can emerge in diverse forms. And how people deal with these problems, they may resolve their diverse issues in very, very different ways. What can be understood from the writings in the context of the historiographical writings is that many regions were marginalized in the process of writing. And the reason for this marginalization of the diverse regions in the Indian context is that there is a lack of historical materials to study these marginalized regions. One of the problems with this is that why this could not be accounted for is that people who knew about these regions are fast dying out or vanishing. And that is why, from a methodological approach, it is very, very important to collect these testimonies urgently. Because once these people are gone, we cannot gather different or divergent perspectives from these various regions. So, it's important that work has to be done to collect as much as material or data from these diverse regions. And what emerges from these two models, somewhere it is portrayed that women are agents of patriarchy. In other words, women are socially conditioned to perpetuate the norms of patriarchy. In other words, women reinstate those very patriarchal structures, ideas, or behaviors that may be influenced from a more patriarchal setup. In other words, women are dependent on men for social and their economic status, and hence compete against each other to serve the interests of men. So primarily, everything is revolving around men, and this can cause women to work against each other because of how they're reinstating those patriarchal ideas in the context of understanding or talking about society. When we're talking about reform movements in relation to women's education, British India concentrated primarily on 4 core regions. And these 4 core regions were in an advantageous position to get the benefits of the modern education. And in this process, other regions were marginalized. And this is what appears from the writings if we depend on historical records. We have very little information from the marginalized regions. And the history of colonial India has largely been written on the basis of core regions which primarily concentrate on the Bombay Presidency, the Madras Presidency, the Bengal Presidencies, and the northwestern provinces. So what we see in historical writing and the material which forms the writing of historical materials is primarily concentrating on these four core regions. In other words, the other regions have been marginalized because material has not been gathered to talk about the social reform movements in the context of education and the status of women in the diverse regions. Now, how can we understand or provide a critique of the present history of women's education? This kind of portrayal of the core understanding of these regions and women's education, it presumes that the rest of India has the same kind of history. By understanding the history of these four core regions, it appears to anybody that this can be applied to the whole of India or across India. But what is interesting is this may not be the case in all the regions of India. So, some collected testimonies and written history from other regions of India show that the issues that were important in the core regions may not have been of utmost importance in these other regions. So what emerges is that what is important in these core regions is not actually important in the other regions. So henceforth, understanding history from that perspective of the core regions cannot be generalized on other regions. And this history of the marginalized areas needs to be collected by gathering the testimonies from people who know more about the regions during the colonial people or the colonial period. If there are archival material, you may get it. But we may need to depend more on people and their oral narratives to understand these perspectives. So how do we understand women's education in some marginalized areas? This is collected from the oral testimonies of the people from these regions. And it is to be included to the little written history that exists of these regions. And their histories of these marginal areas shows divergent trends. And this is not necessarily similar to the core regions that we are talking about, the Bombay Presidency, the Madras Presidency, and so on and so forth. So the educational reform in these areas is somewhat different from these other areas. What emerges from these regions is that women have been highly visible in the public space. And the meaning of education is not necessarily the same as in the core regions. Say for example, in Manipur, the whole education primarily dependent on oral education. Hence, despite no literacy, women were educated because it was all dependent on oral. It was passed on through the oral channel. And women not only were educated through the oral education, but also participated in the public and political spheres. So what we see is women have been active in participation in the public spaces. And in the context of Bihar, women hardly went to school, but participated in public spheres and in the decision-making process at home. Now, if we look at the models which have been talking about it, they emphasize more on the need for education to change the status of women. But we see few examples that are talking about that this has already been going on in the various regions. So these histories are slightly different. In Kerala, a girls' school was begun by the Maharani of Travancore. So what we see is that the idea of opening up schools and women participation was already taking place in certain pockets of the country. So it's not that only the education which or Western educated individuals came back to India and participated in the context of reform movements, they opened up such spaces. It's not necessary. These spaces were opening up in different contexts. In Uttar Pradesh, Syed Ahmad Khan gave a testimony against girls' education. But girls' schools functioned, and despite parda amongst Muslim women, women participated in school education and went to schools. In another region of Himachal Pradesh, women took active part in public life. And there was no stigma attached to girls' education when it began in 1848. So what we see is that women were coming forward in public spaces also to participate. Now, what does this mean? This shows that the history of women's education based on the core British India cannot be applicable to the whole of India. In other words, there is an alternative history also which needs to be taken into account in understanding education of women in the context of 19th century India. So what this leads us to is that there is a need to reformulate this history. How do we reformulate this? It has to be based on the historical material that has been collected from the marginalized regions of India. That means depending only on the core region and the education or the history which has been written in the context of the core, and we try and understand whole of India, this can be problematic. So in conclusion, what we learn from this module is that there have been two models which have been constructed to understanding women's education in 19th century India. One is the retroactive model and the other is a proactive reform model. These two models, though, have accounted for women's education and their history in the context of 19th century India, but they have limitations in their conceptualization and understanding of women's education in 19th century India, because they were highly dependent on the written records in the context of the core areas of British India. They neglected or oversaw the role of the different diverse regions and the role of women and education in these areas. And this also shows that the status of women in these regions were slightly different from what has been portrayed in the writing in these two reform models. So henceforth, what is required is to look at also history from the marginalized regions in understanding the status of women and education in 19th century India. Thank you.